The bells of the Red Keep were not yet awake when the king rose from his bed and found the windows full of a cautious light. A thin gray lay over Blackwater Bay like ash on cooling coals, and the ships slept at their moorings, masts etched fine as pins against the paling east. Robert Baratheon stood there a time, broad-shouldered and barefoot on cold stone, and let the salt on the breeze sting him clean. He breathed it as if it were a draught of some bracing mountain water, and when he exhaled, the vapor of his breath hung and fled like a ghost. The room behind him carried the gentle disorder that follows the end of sleep. Folded blankets left soft with warmth, a tray of last night's bread and cheese, the faintest imprint in the pillows where a dark head had lain. He did not turn to look. He knew the shape by heart, the angle of cheekbone, the tangle of hair black as a raven's wing, the way her hand sometimes went searching for the hilt of dreams and found, instead, his shoulder. There were flowers in a silver ewer by the hearth, their scent cool and blue, gathered from the little gardens below, and set there the night before by a hand more practiced with reins and bows than with arranging blooms. They were, nevertheless, arranged, loose, careless, unsubtle, and the sight of them tugged softly at him. He lifted the leather doublet from the chair by the window, felt the weight of the stitched bore on the breast, as one might feel the weight of an old oath, and set to buckling it with fingers that had remembered how to be deft again. No whine on his breath, no ache behind his eyes. His body had the honesty that always came in these hours before the court had fully put on its perfumes and lies. The king took a final look at the bay, at the tight knots of gulls circling the quays, at the humble fires kindled by fisherfolk in the shanties beyond the walls, and then went out, his footfalls quiet in the corridor. The keep at dawn breathed different air from the palace of noon. The corridors kept secrets. The tapestries hung here held the world together by threads of winter blue and pale gold, and the stones smelled faintly of lime and damp and salt. Robert descended to the yard where the ground was churned to a dark bread by the feet of men and horses, and the rain that had come in the night from the southeast. He found the master-at-arms already waiting with 2 practice maces, and a nod that was almost a bow. "Majesty," said the man, neither gruff nor smooth, and proffered the maces as a priest might offer the bread. "I have had them weighted." Robert took the heft of one in his hand and passed the other to the man to test its twin. He rolled the shoulders, felt the old measure of his reach, and stepped into the ring of packed earth that the early light touched aslant. Sir Barristan Selmy watched with the eyes of a man who had already been up an hour and would be up for 6 more. With him, 2 of the king's guard, young men of good name and better pride, kept the gate with the white enough to shame the gulls. Robert grinned at them. The grin was the old one, the one that had lived at Summerhall and Storm's End and in half the taverns from the Wendwater to Gulltown. But it did not sprawl across his face as it once had. He had taught it to keep house with him. "If I fall," he called out, "you may tell the queen I slipped on a courtier's tongue." The master-at-arms, a square-faced marcher-man with a scar that had the shape of a thorn, set his feet and raised his weapon. The first exchanges were polite, iron-kissing oak, the balms of habit and respect. But soon the old heat came, like the quickening of a blacksmith's forge when the bellows were pressed, and the ring of the maces found their old language. Robert moved not as he had in his youth, all thunder and waste, but as a man who had learned each step could be a word in an argument with death. He slid and circled and kept his balance. The sweat came clean and tasted of salt. His breath deepened and then steadied, and when he laughed, it was not the laugh of a man trying to make the hall forget. It was simply a sound that was fit to happen with the morning. He took a blow on the forearm, brought his own mace down to jar the other man's wrist, and then struck twice, once to disarm, once to end it. The master-at-arms went down into the mud and grinned up like a boy caught with his hand in the pie dish. Robert offered his hand and hauled the man up with a practiced pull. "Well enough," he said. "Again tomorrow." Sir Barristan stepped forward then, white cloak stirring faintly. "Majesty," the old knight said, "the Lord Hand is convened for the morning board." Robert wiped his face with a linen and felt, as he always felt in these moments, the old tug between the simple speech of the yard and the intricate grammar of councils. He gave the thin smile that had grown native to his mouth and nodded. Then let us go find how many ways the realm can be misspent before breakfast. The small council chamber kept its own season. It had a way of being cool, when the rest of the keep baked, and warm, when the sea mists crawled inland, and Robert suspected that Jon Arryn had contrived it so. The Lord Hand had been a man who did not like to be made to shiver or to sweat while he was teaching the kingdom to behave itself. He stood now at the long table, his hair white as the foam along a winter shore, the falcon pin at his throat bright as a drop of cold water. He gave Robert the look they had shared since the days of Storm's End. Comradely, measured, fond, and full of the kind of honesty that did not bang cups on tables. "We have the customs tallies from Gulltown," the Hand said by way of greeting, "and the first of the reports from Lyanna sport on the new measures. Stannis has sent proposed schedules for dock repairs in King's Landing, and for a levy of seasoned shipwrights to be borrowed from the Arbor for half a year. We should begin there." The others were taking their places. Renly, neat beard and green silk, and the sleepy bravado of a younger brother who had learned to turn charm into a shield. Stannis already present, jaw set like a whetstone, eyes that had never needed to be told how to keep count. The Master of Whispers, eyes soft and hands folded as if he held a dove in each. The Lord Treasurer, plump and meticulous. And at the far end, "I will hear Stannis first," Robert said and took his chair. The chair was too heavy for any man who did not have the back for it. Robert had the back. He moved no flagons when he sat. When they brought watered ale, he sipped. The scent of the blue flowers he had left upstairs seemed to have followed him. A faint breath somewhere under the furniture, polish and vellum. Stannis unfolded a chart with the crispness of a man who never wasted motions. "We are repairing docks with rotten pilings while the customs houses sit in worse repair," he said without preface. "A pier that drops a sailor into the Blackwater is an offense to sense and a danger to trade. But a record that cannot be trusted starves His Majesty's coffers while the pier is being mended. We need 8 men who cannot be bought, 4 to oversee written tallies at the quayside, 4 to move between customs houses unannounced. They will be hated." "Good, good," Renly smiled. "Stannis, do try not to frighten the gulls. They're delicate creatures. Then let them nest somewhere else," Stannis said. Robert rapped his knuckles once on the table. 8 men who cannot be bought," he said. "Do such exist? I shall have Jon Arryn cloned 8 times. He let the laugh he could not help escape, and then shook his head. "I take your point. We will have the clerks. Varys, if you smile like that, say why." The spymaster opened his hands. "Only that an honest clerk is rarer than a brave man, but easier to replace when he falls. My little birds tell me there is a scribe in the customs house at the King's Gate who leaves his work early of a Wednesday to visit a woman on the Street of Sisters. He locks his tallies in an oaken chest before he goes. His key, a brass thing he keeps in his shoe. The chest is not difficult to pick. We might sacrifice the scribe and make a spectacle of his superior. A spectacle is an honest man's ally." "And no." Jon Arryn's mouth made a line. "We do not make spectacles for the pleasure of the crowd," he said. "But I would have the realm understand that the days of counting twice and paying once are passing. Take him, if the proof is sound. But let there be a court, not a theater." "Men? If so." Robert looked at Jon Arryn and saw that glint again. Steel under velvet. A righteous impatience with the laziness of men who had never gone hungry. He felt a flare of love for the old falcon, and an answering resolve, like a man tying back his hair before work. "We proceed," he said. "The chest shall be opened." The scribe questioned, his master as well. "If they are thieves, let them be named thieves. The gold cloaks answer to me in this, not to any lord in silk. Stannis, your 8 men. Pick them out of the poorest districts and the most distant castles. Bring me a riverman who can count to 20 with his boots on, and a fisherman from Maidenpool with hands too chapped for ink, but a head that keeps a net's knots." "Then no one." Renly spread his hands. "And when they are accused of being your creatures, brother, what pronouncement shall we make?" "That the king has creatures," Robert said. "It will shock no one." The talk went on for an hour and a half. and the dawn brightened to a pale gold morning that did not quite warm the stone. Jon Arryn took them through a list of small matters that were, together, the very spine of the realm: adjudications of tolls on river ferries, the standardization of weights in the markets, the proper measure of salt cod for tithes in the crown lands, the repair of mileposts along the Roserad so that the distances did not change with each steward's convenience. They set wages for work gangs. They drafted a letter to the Lady of Old Town requesting a loan of 5 master stonecutters, and another to the Archmaester of Accounts at the Citadel, asking for a man to set the city's tallies to rights. Robert listened and spoke when it was needed. Men who had thought him incapable of attending to the turning of the realm's gears had learned to choose their illusions more carefully. He found a fierce plain satisfaction in the little victories: a fairer toll for a village of poor fishers, an instruction to clear beggar holes from the king's way and plant hardy trees to shade the long walk of summer. His hand, broad and roughened by a weapon again, made a blunt signature at the bottom of a page. When the meeting was done, he stood, the chair scraping the flagstones softly. "We will see petitions tomorrow," he said. "And the day after that, and the day after. I will not hear that some Lord Steward has kept supplicants waiting a week. Send them up in tens. We will move the benches into the throne room." Jon Arryn inclined his head. "As you say, Your Grace." Varys' soft voice followed him to the door. "There is a matter from across the narrow sea," the eunuch said, and it was like a finger slipping between pages to mark a place. "A quiet matter. The last Targaryen boy does not starve, though he complains loudly of hunger. He has made himself a patron and a fat man with soft hands and a quicker mind than his appetite suggests. What the boy is, the man could make him worse or better, given time." "Then?" Robert stopped, hand on the door, and did not turn. The corridor beyond lay white and cool as milk. He heard Jon Arryn draw a breath. He knew what the old wrath could do to a man. He had slept with that wrath like a bitter bride for too long. He pictured a boy with silver hair and a mouth shaped like arrogance, because it had never been shown anything else. "Does the boy have a sister?" Robert asked, and his voice did not choke on it. "A child," Varys said. "The girl was born in fear and smoke and storm." "She does not yet plot. Then we will not be the first to teach her fear," Robert said, and felt Jon Arryn's stillness behind him loosen slightly. "Keep me informed. If the boy grows into a dagger, I will take the dagger from him. Until then, no secret murders of children. I am neither Aerys nor Tywin." "A comfort," Varys breathed. He did not bow. He merely disappeared into the habit of shadow that he had made of himself. Stannis was already speaking with Jon Arryn in low tones about ships and timber. Renly had gone, green silk whispering. Robert stepped out and set his feet toward the gardens. The Godswood in the Red Keep did not have a heart tree. It held old oaks and elms, and a yew as dark as a widow's gown, and the pool at its heart remembered everything in the city that sought quiet. Lyanna preferred it in the early hours, when the dew still gripped the grass, and the small birds were brave. When he found her, she was sitting cross-legged on the warm stone lip of the pool, with her boots off and her toes sending ripples into the mirrored leaves. Her hair was braided back with a leather thong. A circle of blue flowers lay beside her on the stone, as if set down by a ghostly girl and forgotten, but he knew that she had picked them for her own reasons and would not defend them if a bee took a fancy. "You rose without waking me," she said. Her eyes were on the water. It held her like a girl holds her breath under a winter pond to frighten her brothers. She had always liked the danger of breath held quiet. "You sleep too little," he said, and sat beside her. The stone ticked under the sun like a loaf crust cooling. He watched their reflections tremble into nonsense, then cohere again. "We are to plant trees along the king's way," he said after a time, "and hang thieves at the docks if Stannis has his way. Jon will have a judge at every market day by midsummer if he can train them without softening their spines. Varys has a whisper about the silver-headed boy." She turned then, still with that look that always made him feel mismeasured. Lyanna was not a court beauty. She had been born for winter fields, for wind and horseflesh, and the old songs that lay under the old gods, like nets under ice. There were shadows at the corners of her mouth and eyes that had nothing to do with age. She had seen too many men die, and too many boys promise heaven in spring and carry back only mud. Come autumn, she studied him as if he were a piece of tack that needed oiling. And will you hang the boy? She asked softly. If he grows to be a man who seeks to drown us, Robert said. Not before. John Arryn reminded me once that wrath is a spice. You use it to remember that life has taste. You do not season the whole pot with it. Mademoiselle. John Arryn has never eaten a meal that was ruined by spice, Lyanna said. But her mouth turned at the corner, and he could hear her agreement in the tilt of her head. How many men did you need in the yard today before your pride was satisfied? Only one, he said, and he will not be walking evenly before noon. Then be kind to him this afternoon. She murmured, You are too fond of making men your mirror. I wish Tywin Lannister would hold a mace against me. Just once, Robert said. And the broth of his old humor bubbled. But he is all knives and ledgers. He sends letters that smell of lavender and think themselves sharper than steel. Tywin Lannister, Lyanna said, and there was a wolf's short huff in the way she shaped the name. He breeds arrogance and calls it gold. How many of the small folk keep his measure? The city remembers the burning of the gates. The city remembers who opened them. It remembers too who paid the butcher for the beef and the brothel for the girl. We do not give him more mouths to feed. Damn, you have a way of taking my pikes and setting them as hedges, Robert said. But yes, no more dancing over Lannister snares for the sake of pretty cloaks. The hand hates him, and the hand is wise. Stannis hates him, and Stannis is unable to be foolish. I will not marry his daughter to... Lyanna's fingers plucked at the edge of the stone. She did not smile at that, but he saw the light change on her face and knew something in her had settled. The wind shifted. The yew breathed darkly, and somewhere in the deeper leaves a dove committed itself to a coo. Ride with me, she said, standing with one fluid movement and catching up her boots by their old leather tongues. Before the city begins to remember who it pretends to be, their rides beyond the city had become a ritual so necessary that the city, had it been a creature with kindness in its bones, might have made room for them as a body makes room for breath. They rode out through the river gate with two white shadows behind them and a gray-shirted groom who had the good sense not to speak. They took the King's Way only long enough to feel how smooth it had become since the gangs had laid crushed stone and rolled it while it was still damp with their sweat. Then they cut north across the low meadows where goats hunched like stones and children's laughter rose thin as kite string. Lyanna rode a gray mare with a stubborn jaw and a mind for turning her head to watch the world come up behind her. Robert had long ago learned the grace required to ride beside something that would not agree for the sake of agreement. He learned it again most days in council. He let the mare drift a length ahead and watched Lyanna's shoulders, the way she listened to the wind on the grass and to the birds in the trees they had not yet reached. She carried a short bow slung across her back. She carried no jewels. She had placed the blue flowers in her hair in a way that made them look as if they had grown there, as ivy grows on a stone wall. Outside the walls, the city wore a childhood face, newly washed and curious. The air was full of summer's first promises. They came at last to a hill that had been shaved for some forgotten lord's folly. There had been talk of a tower once, and the foundation stones still made a ring like a crown left lying in the grass. From here, they could see the city entire, the smudge of Flea Bottom, and the red sprawl of the keep, and the green knives of the Seps towers. Ships speckled the bay and looked like children's toys. The road to Rosby made a pale stitch-up from the far gate and vanished into country that remembered kings older than Robert. Lyanna slid from the saddle and stood a while with her eyes closed. Robert took the horse's reins and waited until she opened them again. "Do you remember?" she asked without looking at him. "The first time you saw the sea?" "I remember the taste of it more than the sight," he said. "8 storms end they put salt on everything, and in winter the wind is made of it. My uncles said the sea keeps eating and never grows fat. How could I not love something with such a vice? No. She laughed, a quick spill of water over stone. I had never looked at so much water at once when I came south. The first time. I thought it must be a god. I put my hand into it on the beach and took it out, and it was wet like everything else. She turned and looked at him directly, the flowers in her hair making their quiet arguments with the wildness in her mouth. Some things are made gods. They do not ask. The making is done by those who kneel. Are you telling me to stand, girl? Robert asked gently. I am telling you that when the city calls you king, it is a god's name on their tongue, she said. But it is a god they made to be hungry on their behalf. They would feed it anything to be rid of the little hungers that gnaw them. That is not our compact. You and John Arryn, he said. I am beset by prophets. My brother would say, I am a poor prophet, she answered, and something in her voice wore a fur cloak for a moment. Then it was gone. The compact is this. We will spend the realm's gold on roads, courts, ships, ditches, granaries, and the harbor chain. We will spend it on measurements that do not change with each steward's nephew. We will spend it on a captain of the city watch, who is not bought with a goose at Michaelmas. We will not spend it on a feast in which the candles cost more than any small folk's winter. We will eat more simple than the city believes us capable of, and sleep in sheets that do not remember 10 odors at once. That is how the wolf understands kingship. Nenpao. Robert stood with his hands on his hips and let the mare blow in his ear. The vision of candlelight and roast boar and 100 cups of wine rose in him like a ghost that would not admit it was dead. He looked at it. He nodded to its lingering seductions, and then he watched it walk down into the city and vanish into the red stone where it belonged in another life. The harbor chain, he said. Stannis wants iron thick as my leg. He has calculations for counterweights and the number of men to pull it across the mouth of the bay in an hour. He said once, perfectly calm, that if he had had such a chain 3 years ago, he would have strangled half of Balon Greyjoy's fleet with it before breakfast. Bay? Balon Greyjoy, Lyanna said, tasting the name as if it were iron on her tongue. Do you think his pride will stay asleep now that the realm is forgetting how to sing itself blind? His eyebrows rose. You hear of ironmen in the market, and you do not tell me. I hear of fishermen in the market, she said, and words that smell of salt and bear too many scars for the speaker's years. I hear of men who do not spend when they are drunk, because they do not drink. Or perhaps they are keeping their coppers for iron like their fathers taught them. Perhaps they are only miserly with fear. It is a sound I know, Robert. It lives near Winterfell, when the white comes down like a weight from the sky, and the men measure wood with their eyes. Bow. He looked over the city, at the line where sea met sky, and at the ships that already knew more than they were telling. Then we will finish the chain, he said, and turn the city watch about and make it walk on its feet like a soldier. John Arryn will have courts at the market days, and the scribes will write what the judges say to be law, where men can see it. The Ironborn can come and look at the chain and decide if they have anything else to lose. Stannis is right about the shipwrights from the arbor. We will pay for proper timber and not have deck planks that spring like cheap beds. No. Lyanna nodded once. It was not assent as a courtier gives, but the acknowledgement of someone who has put her own shoulder to the wheel and feels the same strain. And we will find another 100 small things to set to rights before nightfall, she added, with the fierce cheer of a woman tallying chores she likes. Else I will take a switch to the lot of you. He caught her about the waist then and hoisted her off her feet. Just an inch, enough to make her give the little gasp she loathed giving. She elbowed him without much conviction, and he set her down, and they looked at each other, and the look said that the world was a long road, and they meant to ride it with their eyes open. They came back into the city by a different gate, as if to confuse any ill luck that might have followed them out. The markets were beginning to swarm in earnest. Robert tasted onion and smoke, and saw a child with a stack of eels over one shoulder and pride as tall as a lord's. He bought the eels for twice their worth and gave them back to the boy with instructions to sell them again, and never to grow up into a man who would mistake trickery for cleverness. The boy stared as if kings were a new kind of street, and Lyanna, watching, laughed and shook her head. By midday the throne room had been emptied of its old staleness and given over to benches that carpenters had built in a hurry with planks and goodwill. The lesser lords had been told to take elsewhere the important manner they wore when it was time to eat. Jon Arryn stood with a little satchel of sweets for his throat and a sheaf of petitions bound with string. Ser Barristan took a post like a white tree near the dais. The first 10 supplicants filed in, bringing with them the smells and noises of the city and the troubles of half a dozen villages in the Crownlands. Robert set himself. Not his temper, but that muscle under temper that lets a man listen also when he would rather bolt. A woman from a river hamlet came forward with a clay pot in both hands and a child on each hip. Her husband had been pressed by a hedge knight with a false warrant and a good horse. She had come as far as the outer yard twice and had been told the king only heard matters that did not concern the poor. Her gaze did not lift far from his boots. "Who told you this?" Robert asked her. "The steward at the outer room." She whispered, "Your Grace." Robert looked at Jon Arryn, who did not need to be told. The hand's head dipped once, and he made a mark with his quill that was likely to end in a man's dismissal. "You've come to tell me the truth," Robert said to the woman. "Do you lie to your children, mother?" "No, Your Grace." "Do not lie to your king either," he said, and felt the old fury as something that could be yoked to a plow. "Hedge knights have no warrants to press men. Find me this knight, describe him, and then go to the far table and have a loaf and a piece of bacon each. You will sleep in the keep tonight and have an escort home tomorrow. What is pressed will be unpressed." "Mouse." The woman wept as if her eyes were ashamed of the relief, and the children stared and licked grease from their fingers, as if this were a dream they were being careful with. The next man was a tanner whose pits had fouled the water in his neighbor's canal. The law had no taste for such new matters, and here Jon Arryn proved himself one of the few men in the realm who could make a rule without turning the past into a cudgel. He set a fine that would sting and a schedule for covering the pits and building a culvert with stones from the quarry. He asked the men if they could agree to keep the peace while their grudges were taught to be useful. Then there was a boy who had walked from Duskendale with a letter from his septon and a black eye from men who had relieved him of the coin his mother had sewn into his tunic. He wished only to be apprenticed, and no man from the guild would take him because the coin was gone, and the letter was not enough. Robert sent for the master of chandlers and asked him if he wished kings to light their halls or to sit in the dark misreading good letters as fraud. The master was a stiff-necked woman with a voice like a kettle left too long over the flame. She looked at the boy a long time, and then she said she would take him if he would stop squeezing his hat, as if it were a bird he wished to kill. "Little things. It is always the little things," Jon Arryn had said to him more than once, "each of them small enough to be ignored. Together, they are the tide. But a man could turn a tide if he taught the coastline where to stand and how much sand to give." When the afternoon stretched thin, Robert sent the last of the 10 away and stood. His knees cracked like old branches, but he felt more awake than he had in other years when he had pulled over himself the comfort of a heavy cup. He looked down at his hands. They were large and tended toward bluntness. There were new scars on them. He folded them and let them rest. The court came back as the shadows cooled. Aristocrats in their nearer silks looked at the benches as if they had found a pig asleep in their bed. A messenger's boots rang in the outer corridor. Ser Barristan stepped forward with the prescience of a man who has learned to hear a certain rhythm in urgency. The king's guard parted. The messenger came to one knee and sprang up again because his message was more important than the furniture of reverence. "Your Grace," he said, breathing carefully. "A letter from Casterly Rock. Lord Tywin requests audience. He is already on the road. He brings a train suitable to his station." "Dandendero." Robert looked at the seal and let his mouth make no shape at all. He passed the letter to Jon Arryn, who broke it with the same economy with which he had broken the others. The hand's eyes tracked left to right and then rose. "Suitable to his station," he said dryly. "There will be difficulty in finding him accommodation that satisfies. He also suggests an understanding to relieve certain inconveniences between the Rock and the Crown." "His station is in the west," Robert said. "His inconveniences will be measured by how wide his mouth opens." But he felt that old energetic alertness that had come upon him before battles, like a horse lifting its head at the smell of thunder. Tywin Lannister wanted to test the new grammar of this reign. Tywin had spent a lifetime speaking in ledgers and war. When he had left King's Landing last, his daughter had not been a queen. Lyanna came through the arch then. Her hair loosened by the wind and put up again with her fingers, a strand fallen to make its own law along her jawline. She stood beside Jon Arryn and read the little curtains of air that the men's faces made. And then she said, "Shall I have the steward see to guest beds filled with straw cut from the haystacks beyond the rosewood, and add an extra blanket if the west should feel a chill?" Jon Arryn's mouth made a shape that might have meant he regretted not having borne her. Robert laughed, one brief hard bark that was not unkind. "We will give Tywin his bed," he said. "We will give him courtesy, which costs more to refuse than to grant. He will ask us for my brother's release from Dragonstone, to serve as Castellan at the Rock, or some other absurdity. He will want Jaime freed of his white cloak. He will peddle the idea that Kingsguard vows can be melted with a hot enough iron. He will want always to trick me into the price I do not see. Then, you are not a man who buys meat without looking at the fat," Lyanna said. "You will see. And if you do not, Jon Arryn will have the butcher set the knife just so." They went to dinner with the day's decisions clinging to their garments like burrs. The meal was plain by courtly measure. Roast capon with rosemary and bread still humming from the oven. Greens with vinegar, and a wedge of cheese that smelled like a planned insult. Robert had 1 cup of watered ale, and then another half, and then he finished with water that caught the candlelight and made it honest. He listened to Renly tell a story of a courtier who had mistaken a stable boy for a lord's son and learned to bow to the smell of straw. Stannis watched them all and said little, but when the talk turned to timbers and iron and wages, his voice found its vigor. Later, when the halls were full of the thin talk that comes before bed, Robert walked the covered way to the hand solar. The room was bright with lamplight and the good gloaming of books. Jon Arryn was writing, his quill squaring lines with an old man's steadiness, and beside him, a plate of candied lemon peel lay diminished. He gestured to the chair opposite. "I would have had the gold cloaks drill today," Robert said. "But the captain has again contrived a fever when the yard is busiest. I do not know how a man can sweat so much at the thought of sweat." "Replace him," Jon said. "You will make one enemy and gain the respect of 1,000 men whose respect matters more." "He is a cousin of a minor lordling who gives good horses to the watch in autumn," Robert said. "If I replace him, the lordling will send me a letter in which the word ingratitude appears 5 times. Then keep the horses and lose the cousin," Jon said. "I will draft the reply. The word gratitude will appear once, and it will be enough." Robert smiled. "Will you never let me be lazy, old man?" "I let you be young when you were young," Jon said gently. "These are more difficult times." The king leaned back, the chair creaking, and let his eyes travel the walls that had learned to keep their counsel. "I did not send knives after a child today," he said. "If I were to pray tonight, I would try to be grateful for that." Jon Arryn put down his quill. "Mercy cannot be an accident, Robert," he said. "If you mean to live as you say, with a wolf and a falcon whispering in your ears, I would have you add to them the voice of a judge who knows the difference between a crime and a fear. The boy may become a crime. The girl may become a fear. You have time to be a king in the middle of those 2 truths. There are not many men for whom I would spend these words. You are the one I have." "Then?" "In." Robert's throat closed and then opened again. It amazed him sometimes, how much the things that were simple still managed to lodge in the throat like bones. He reached for one of the candied lemon peels and chewed it as if it might keep him from saying anything foolish. "Tywin comes," he said. "He will bring the West like a weather. He will want to speak to me in a room without witnesses, where he thinks he can define the realm with his eyebrows. I would have you with me when he arrives." "Then?" "I am the hand," Jon said. "I go where the king's grasp is needed. But better than me, bring your wife." Robert looked up with surprise and then felt it soften. The old man's face had a slyness in it that it wore only when he was indulging the faintest of vanities, that he had read a thing in its right order. The lion does not know the wolf's mathematics. Jon went on. He does not understand how a thing can be counted and still run free. He believes that if he can show you the sums, he has found the truth. Bring the woman who does not care for his ledger's ink. She will see what he does not mean to show. Bah! I will bring her, Robert said, and then rose. Do you sleep at all, Jon? Enough, the hand said. Less when the realm becomes ambitious for its own good. Robert walked back through the corridor where the sea's breath meets old ash and oil, and he felt the tiredness in his bones take his hand like an old friend who would walk with him only as far as his door. He entered his chambers and stood a moment in the dark, letting his eyes learn the shapes they had long ago learned. Lyanna was there, already asleep, but not deep, her body holding to the bed like a rider to a horse. He moved carefully, but she woke with the instinct of a winter bird. Her hand came out and found him at the wrist. What has he written in the world tonight? She asked, voice sleep blurred. That I should keep a judge in my ear when I keep a wolf, he said. That mercy is not a stumble. She pulled his hand closer and laid it against her cheek. Then learn to walk, she said. He slept then, as men sleep who have made some bargain with their ghosts. The night pressed its face to the panes and watched the city dream. Of coin and hunger, of candles and chains, of ships with holdfasts and shoals that were only rumors of cruelty. Somewhere a man sharpened a knife to cut rope for honest work. Somewhere a woman hid a coin under a stone, teaching herself the old trick of hope. Stannis sat with a sheaf of numbers until the candle guttered and found that both his justice and his exhaustion were making the same plain arguments. Renly laughed too loud in a salon where laughter was the last coin some flattered themselves they possessed. Varys moved like a quiet rumor through halls that had learned to keep eyes half open. In the Vale, Lysa Arryn stirred under blankets and whispered one name and then another until the night had had enough of her. On Dragonstone, a man whose mouth was tight with fear of becoming useless looked out upon a sea that had not learned yet how to be grateful. Across the water, where men called a stew of alleys by 100 names that all meant hunger, a boy with hair like smoke's memory and temper like a scraped knee practiced being the center of the map in a room with no map. A man with soft hands and a knife of wit, sharpened on grease, smiled and told him stories about kings and the ways they might be made. In a room not far away, a girl with eyes full of weather slept with one hand stretched out to feel for a presence that was not there, but would be someday, if the stories were clever and the ships were punctual. Morning came as it always does, out of habit as much as faith, and found the city with its eyes half open and its mouth already forming the syllables of its bargains. Robert rose again before the bells and went again to the window. The bay of plate that had been wiped with a gray cloth in the night and set again before the day's appetite. He dressed and went out and met the mace with steady arms. The blows rang true in the yard, and the men who watched, whether they wore white or brown or gold, watched the way a man watches a craftsman when he realizes that the craft is not trickery. Sir Barristan came at the hour when the white plume on his helm had drawn one drop of sweat. The Lord of Casterly Rock has entered the city, he said. He has with him banners, wagons, and a patience that would be less admired were we foxes, and he a hen. Robert spat. The spittle darkened the dust and left a small, honest mark. Then I shall dress, he said, and you will have the court arranged not as for a wedding but for work. Bring chairs. Chairs make men more truthful than carpets do. Your Grace, said Barristan with the faintest bow, and was gone. Lyanna's hand was sure on the clasp of his cloak. She fastened it and then smoothed it, as if testing the weave. Her eyes met his and spoke the small language that the body learns to share with one other body in a life that has days like stones and nights like blankets. He will speak as if the world were only sense. She said, do not let him make you pretend you're deaf to everything else. Do you mean to sit? He asked. I mean to stand, she said. It is easier to see what men are hiding when you are not made to be comfortable. They went down to the throne room, which had been given back to its purpose and newly taught another. The benches had not yet been taken away. Men of rank shifted uneasily on them, as if fearing they might catch something useful. John Arryn was there with his quills and his 3 sober little stones of lemon peel. Stannis had a board tucked beneath his arm that showed the harbor with new lines added in darker ink, as if daring the West to try and out-iron him. Renly looked as he always looked, like a man who has prepared a joke and is waiting for the world to present him with the right glass in which to pour it. Tywin Lannister entered with the sun that had finally made up its mind to be hot. He carried his wealth with that calm that comes when a man has not had to swear at a clerk in 20 years. His hair was a color that gold forgives. He bowed only as much as it took to move his vertebrae and kept his eyes on the king's mouth, because he was a man who cared to see where the words began. "Your Grace," he said, "it pleases the West to see the realm is as awake as the East was said to be in the songs." "You speak often of what pleases the West," Robert said, and let the small smile show. "I trust you also know what pleases the crown." Tywin inclined his head that little, exact degree that men learn when they cannot afford to let their hair move. "I am eager to be instructed." "Then you shall be," said John Arryn gently, and in the soft voice was the steel that says a smith means to shape something in the heat that is here. "The crown will require from the rock the exact weights in which it pays its miners. We are standardizing the measures across the realm. We will no longer have stones in the crown lands that weigh a man's honesty, and stones in the West that weigh his guile." Bah! Tywin shifted the barest degree. He had not, Robert thought with the old private joy, expected to begin with rocks. "The West's stones," Tywin said smoothly, "are as honest as the men who carry them." "Then you will not object to an accounting," John Arryn said. "We will send a man from the Citadel to sit with your factor." "The Citadel," Tywin said, and his mouth made a shape of distaste. "Scholars are very diligent at counting, and not always as diligent at understanding what matters. It is an old failing, understanding what matters," Lyanna said, and the court turned, some with surprise at a queen who could speak without permission, some with hunger for the disturbance. "Tell me, Lord Tywin, what matters more? That a sack of flour in Lannisport fills the same number of hands as a sack of flour in King's Landing, or that a ledger written at your table looks handsomer than a ledger written at ours?" Tywin looked at her as if a winter wind had found an unwalled path. He bowed more than a vertebra this time. "Your Grace," he said, and the 2 words had edges. "I have always admired the North's habit of ordering things without writing about it." "Writing is merely a way to make other men ashamed of their laziness," Lyanna said. "We do plenty of ordering without quill or witness." "We do not mean to insult you, my lord," Robert said, stepping the room back a half-foot from the line it had been creeping toward. "We mean to make the realm legible to itself. If there is theft in a customs house, the man will hang. If a tollman weighs his stones out of loyalty to his cousin rather than the law, he will break stones with honest convicts until he remembers the difference. If the rock wishes to help, it can help." "Ow!" Tywin's eyes flicked to Stannis at the word hang, as if to measure which brother would pull the rope. He rested his hands on the head of his cane as if it were a promise made of wood. "I have come," he said, "also to speak of the Kingsguard." Robert's gaze went past Tywin to Jaime Lannister, standing in his white, like a beautiful dagger that had been placed on the wrong table. Jaime's eyes were watchful and bored in equal measure, a contradiction at which some women would have smiled and some men would have thrown a cup. Robert felt a curious pity for him, like the pity one might feel for a hound trained to guard a chicken coop. The hound did not love eggs. "The Kingsguard is not a matter of negotiation," Robert said mildly. "It was not when Aerys lived. It is not now. My son was made to wear white as a rebuke to me," Tywin said. "Do not pretend it was otherwise." "I would never pretend to know Aerys's mind," Robert said dryly. "He pretended well enough for all of us. Your son stands his post like any other knight sworn to my person. He does it well. I will not unmake him to make you whole where you were wounded. Men have taken knives to worse wounds and not been made whole. We all live." Tywin's face became a mask, and behind the mask, Robert could hear the machinery of calculations shift a tooth. He bowed, measured and exact, and the room released the breath it had been keeping. "Then we will speak of coin," Tywin said, "and of ships." They spoke until the sun had moved between two pillars and found them in the same argument as it had found them an hour before. It was not a new dance. It was a dance in which the steps must be rehearsed until each man understood when to place his foot where and why. Tywin offered loans with longer lines attached than ropes laid for a ferry. Jon Arryn placed quills and arithmetic between them like stones in a stream and asked Tywin to either step on them or get his boots wet. Stannis spoke in the short, hot syllables of men who build and repair and do not see why anyone else should demand artistry in the account of a dock piling. Lyanna stood, and when she spoke, she drew each man a little away from himself so that he could see he had a shadow. When Tywin at last was shown to his chambers, which were suitable to his station in that they did not pander to it, Robert sat with his elbows on his knees and let his head hang for a heartbeat. Lyanna's hand found the back of his neck and pressed the heel of her palm into the knot there. He grunted with grateful pain. "He has learned a new way to count," Robert said. "He counts the benches. He did not expect them." "He counts what he can sit on," Lyanna said. "He has never been willing to count what he stands upon." "Stannis will say I gave too much," Robert said. "Renly will say I did not take enough. Jon will say we will live with it for a season and adjust our winter stores accordingly." Lyanna's hand lingered. "And what will you say?" "I will say that if the rock thinks to starve the crown with gold, it will find that I do not eat gold," Robert said. "I eat bread. I drink water and ale and soup. If I am hungry and there is no meat, I chew the broth and find the meat that was there once in my memory. If I must, I will chew memory for a winter. But I will not drink debt as if it were wine." "Bow." "Good," she said, simple as a door closing at night. In the days that followed, the city learned to live with the noise of hammers. The harbor chain crept toward the water like a new river being coaxed into an old bed. Men in coarse shirts laid stones along the kings, way under the eye of a foreman who had broken 2 knuckles on 2 different bullies and kept both H's as if they were tools. Scribes, overseen by men who had been fishermen and knew how to count nets, found that their fingers grew thinner from fear and their ledgers thicker from truth. The gold cloaks drilled in the yard under a new captain who had the habit of looking at men's hands before he looked at their faces. The old captain wrote a letter from a country cousin full of misunderstood words like loyalty and right, and was allowed to keep his horse and go home and decide whether or not he would learn how to be ashamed. Petitioners came and went and came again. The court learned the odd, bracing pleasure of hearing a judgment that fit the case rather than the judge's convenience. Stannis taught the harbor to breathe in and out on a schedule that made sense even when the tides argued. Renly hosted suppers where he charmed men whose usefulness would enjoy being charmed. Varys reported the noises that rats made under floors and the songs sailors sang when they were too tired to be careful. Jon Arryn wrote letters that did not threaten until they did, and then they did not threaten so much as specify. At night, sometimes, Robert sat with Lyanna in a room that did not pretend not to be a room. They reread the day with tired eyes, and said the little prayers they had learned to say without kneeling. So the summer took itself forward on its legs of habit and hope, and if there were storms brewing, and if men in the Iron Islands were counting ships and men in Bravos were counting grievances, those were not yet the only songs the city sang. The realm's pulse still beat under hills and in coats, steady for now. On a morning when gulls were making a map of the bay with their bodies, a rider came in from the north, mud to the knee, and a face that had been wind-chapped into something heroic. He asked for the king and the queen and the hand, all in one breath, and when he had washed and eaten, he stood and delivered the letter with the solemn pride of a man who knows the weight of words and still trusts them. The seal was a gray direwolf caught in wax. The hand was Eddard Stark's, and the words, careful and spare, spoke of a rumor of ship sails west of the Flint Cliffs. The ships had passed like black parentheses closing around a sentence the North had not written. The letter also spoke of a baby's fever in White Harbor that had taken him with the same gravity as the ships. That was the North's way, to understand that storms could be out at sea and inside a cradle on the same day, and call both by their true names. Robert read it twice, and then a third time without seeing it, because he had begun to hear the sea. He passed the parchment to Jon Arryn, and then to Lyanna, whose mouth did not change but whose eyes did, a little, the way a river does when it passes over a stone it remembers. We will not panic at the rumor of sails, Jon said. But we will assume the Ironborn remember that they have boats and have now remembered the tide table. Stannis, Robert said, find out how quickly we can make that chain move. And how many men we can set to watch from Duskendale to Massey's Hook who can send a hawk faster than a gossip. And if there are no hawks, Stannis asked, then teach the gossips the right words, Lyanna said. And pay them in bread and salt and coin. Coin that weighs the same as the coin in Lannisport. Stannis nodded, jerked once, and went as if the order had been a torch placed in his hands, whose flame he would not waste by walking slowly. Robert stood at the window, the same window at which he had stood the morning when the salt had first washed him. The gray line beyond the city had the placid look a cat has before it springs. He felt that old confluence of heat and measure in his blood. He would not drink. He would not crack jests until the room hid its anxieties and laughter. He put his hands on the sill, and for a moment, imagined the whole realm as a vast, stubborn beast, whose head he held, and whose mouth he would not let foam. Let us find out what the sea is saying, he said, and the city, if it had been listening, would have understood that it was the king who had spoken, the man who had made a compact with his wolves, and his falcons, and his judges, and his ghosts. The city would have understood that the slow work of days had been teaching the realm a way to stand before storms arrived, and that this too was a kind of music. E-ka. The letter's words seemed to crisp under his thumb, as if the wax itself remembered winter. Robert closed his hand gently and felt the raised lines of Eddard's script, as if they were scars on a friend's face. The room was full of small sounds, the mutter of a cooling hearth, the distant skirl of gulls, the soft deliberate ticking of the hand's sandglass upon the shelf. Jon Arryn stood a little to the side, not crowding the feeling, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that men who carried swords needed room to put them down. Ships seen west of the flint cliffs. No landings. Smoke at dusk like breath on the waves. Robert said the words aloud once, and then returned the parchment to the hand. Eddard does not waste ink on fancies. He does not, Jon said. Nor does he mistake a fisherman's tale for a herald's trumpet. We treat it as the first step of a march, not as the march. Then Sandero. The Ironborn don't write their intentions on their sails, Robert muttered, and looked past the room to where the bay lay like a promise that could be kept or broken as a man pleased. How long for the chain? 3 weeks before we can draw it entire, Stannis said from the threshold, as if he had been pressed out of the stone by the question. We can test the western span in 9 days if we push the men through the heat. The links seize at the joins if we force them too soon. The oilers need time. I need 2 more crews of riveters. I need a foreman who does not tell me he has a cousin who can count. I need, as usual, less idiocy. Then you always do, Robert said, and the corner of Stannis' mouth twitched like a man who has remembered a joke he refuses to retell. You'll have the riveters. Redwine sends shipwrights by the end of the week. He says he is pleased to lend timber and men to a king who knows the difference between a keel and a wedding gift. Stannis grunted. He knows which way a wind blows when it fills 2 sails. Lyanna came in then, and all the room rearranged itself around the simple fact of her presence. She read Eddard's hand, and he watched her eyes move with that precise economy of thought that had always made him feel that if she had been given a blade at birth, she would have learned to shave the world with it. The coast between the rills and the cliffs is full of blind coves, she said. Bear Island's fishermen count stars to find their way home. A longship can play fox with coasts like that. Send not only riders on the high roads, but men who know where the tide rots the weed and where the stones eat a man's knee. Then, the North knows its own coast, Robert said. Still. Hawks from Duskendale, Rosby, Crackclaw. I'll not have a man say the crown kept an earful of silk while iron crept around the back of our skull. Jon Arryn folded the letter and slid it with an old tenderness into a leather folder that carried other old tendernesses. I will write Lord Manderley in White Harbor, he said. I will also write Lord Royce in the Vale. The sistermen will see shadows even when there are none. The trick is to teach them to shout when the shadow is cast by a mast and not by a cloud. Lyanna's gaze flicked to Stannis. And you, Lord Brother, will stop measuring the men, and start measuring the men you want them to become. Pick a captain who does not drink and a boatswain who does not lie. If you cannot find both on one ship, make them sleep under the same sail until one learns the other's habit. Then Stannis stared at her with that pained respect he reserved for people who gave orders he could not argue with on the grounds of fact. I will have a list of names to the council by noon, he said, and the oilers will work by lamplight. I will not be kept from my bed by a slow wick. Be kept from it by victory, Lyanna said, but not unkindly, and Stannis went with his shoulders already moving like a man pushing a cart uphill, because there is nothing else to be done with a cart. They sent ravens, north and east and west, into the Vale and along the coast, to White Harbor and to Moat Cailin, and to a tower on a lonely headland, where a man with one good leg watched a salt-licked horizon with a spyglass and a stubborn wish not to die of boredom. Robert sealed them not as a man seals words he wants to forget, but with the neat, unavoidable pressure of a thumb that has learned to leave a clean mark. Afterward, they ate simply. Oaten bread with honey and apples cut clean to their cores, cheese with a rind that bit back, and Robert felt his strength settle the way a good meal settles in a man who has not sinned against his own belly. He took the yard again for a short time, not to batter at a man but to measure his feet on the packed earth, to feel his breath and the way his bones spoke to each other. The white cloaks watched and did not talk among themselves. Word from the west, Varys breathed in the archway as if a breeze carrying a rumor had formed itself into a man. Lord Tywin has more wagons than he has patience. He asks to know whether the crown intends to sit in judgment of a certain large matter, or whether the matter is too large to sit. Robert took a cloth and wiped his hands. He had known the day would come. He had been stepping around it like a puddle he preferred to ignore, and had learned that the only thing to do with a puddle was to put your boot in it and feel how deep it was. He remembered Elias named the way a man remembers a tune he cannot sing. He remembered the bodies that had been laid out as coins in the sack, and the way people had counted them with their eyes to be certain the debt had been paid. He had not sat a throne then. He was a man learning how to be something that did not involve breaking things to prove they could be broken. Tell Lord Tywin, Robert said, that the crown intends to sit all the way down. And tell him the seat does not wobble. He turned his head a little. Send to River Run as well. I would have Lord Hoster's counsel. He is as vain as a roast peacock, but he is not a fool, and he hates being a flutter when there is meat on the table. Ben? John Arryn made a noise that might have been assent, and might have been the clearing of a throat that had swallowed enough pride in its life to be allowed to complain. Will you summon the men by name? Varys asked softly. By deed, Robert said. Name follows. Send a writ to Clegan's Keep. Sir Gregor is to present himself before his king by the Feast of the Maiden. Send another to Sir Emery Lorch. I want him in the city by the same date. If either man has other business, the city will keep it safe for him until his return. Nems. Varys inclined his head. And if they do not come, then they are outlaws, Robert said. He did not raise his voice, and he did not clench a fist. And the realm will learn that the word means something. I will not have the North. That's Dorne's grief as much as the North's. Whispering my name as it whispers Tywin's. Send a rider toward Sunspear as well, with the letter we have already written and sealed twice, and not yet sent because we were afraid of our own ghosts. The one that says we will hear a Dornishman speak of Elia, and of Rhaenys and Aegon in the King's Hall, and will not mistake grief for treason. Then see. That letter, Varys said, and for a heartbeat his eyes showed the man inside the habit, will circle the world twice before it sits. Let it circle, Robert said. It will roost here. They broke the quiet as if breaking bread, with their own small particularities. Stannis went to count. Renly went to converse. Varys went to whisper and listen. Jon Arryn went to write. Lyanna went to the Godswood, which was not a Godswood, but was the nearest thing the city could manage without having to kill its own conscience for the sake of an old tree. Robert went with her as far as the door, and then turned aside, not because he feared the old gods, but because he had learned to let a woman have her silences the way she let him have his. The days that followed took shape as men take shape who mean to be seen standing when the weather changes. The chain crept from barge to barge, black and oiled, and on certain evenings, men of the city walked down to the quay to watch the iron snake be taught to coil without king. In the market, a crier read, in a clear voice that had once sold fish, the new weights and the punishments for those who mistook their scales for friends. In the yard of the Red Keep, the gold cloaks learned that a whistle could march a man faster than fear, if the man blowing it knew the difference between a whistle and a complaint. In Flea Bottom, a woman who had been told once by a whisper in a doorway that her boy had been pressed into a hedge knight's company, discovered that the whisper had been wrong. A boy who looked too thin to be so proud came back with his ear torn where a lordling squire had tried to tug him into obedience, and had found that the boy had learned the king's new grammar and did not wish to use the old words for what was his. At the hand's direction, 3 judges went to the market squares on 3 market days, and there they spoke to tanners and cloth merchants and salt sellers, and said plainly that the law was a man with a mouth, not just a sign on a post. A miller who had been shaving flour with a wooden spoon learned that shame wears a baker's laugh as badly as any other coat, and paid coin and grain to the widows he had made into beggars by his spoon. The old captain of the city watch sent a letter from a cousin's hearth complaining of ingratitude and winters too close for comfort. He received back, in a neat hand, a reply that was not unkind, and that made it very clear that a man could be grateful to a horse, and yet ask the man who rode it to dismount. Tywin Lannister, for his part, wore patience the way a lord wears a cloak in summer, because it is expected, and because it conceals how the heat is gnawing at him. He went where he was told. He accepted that his train must be stabled in quarters fit for lesser animals. He spoke when spoken to, and not otherwise. At table, when he spoke of coin, he spoke of it with the kind of care that men reserve for children they have never loved. When Jon Arryn set before him a sheet full of numbers that lived in columns like sober monks, Tywin did not smile. He took out a small lens and considered the addition with the same attention a man gives to a blade he thinks may be chipped. "Your tallies assume a loss of 3 in 20 by a pilferage at the docks," he said once. "Mine assume 2. Your docks are not my docks," Stannis said. "That," Tywin answered, "is a sentence I have never been more pleased to hear." Lyanna listened and learned that the world could turn on whether a man liked the number 2 or the number 3. She discovered a new reserve of contempt for the kind of ease that required a man to win at columns what he had never learned to build with hammers. She also learned that Jon Arryn could make men sweat by asking them if they agreed with themselves a second time. When the replies came from the west, they came along 2 roads at once. The writ to Clegane's keep was returned unopened, mud-smeared and smelling of horse and iron, and something else that had once been meat. The messenger said he had handed it to a squire who had no eyebrows and who had laughed without moving his face. The writ to Amory Lorch went to a house where the man had not paid his farrier. It was acknowledged by a steward who had gone pale under his freckles when he read the words outlaw and present yourself and king. "He will not come," Jon Arryn said in the council chamber as the afternoon grew thick and outside the window. A girl tried to sell a string of dead larks to a cook who would buy them for the pleasure of plucking them clean. "Then he is already half the thing we say he will be," Robert answered. "Send out proclamations to the city and to the west. Let it be known that the king will sit in judgment whether the men in question attend or do not. Send to Sir Beric Dondarrion, and ask him to come with 50 men of his own choosing, and to have the decency to wear a different color than his ordinary, because I have a mind to see him without being blinded." "Then Dalwyn, Beric," Renly said, pleased that the talk had at last turned to something that might involve a handsome man on a horse. "He will enjoy the errand the way a boy enjoys a piece of fruit he is not sure he is allowed to eat. Better a boy who enjoys the fruit of justice than a man who hides it in a cupboard," Lyanna said. "Dorne will hear as much from our choices as from our letters." Dorne did hear. The rider to Sunspear arrived with salt dried white along his horse's flanks. He passed under arched windows, where women watched from behind screens the color of ripe dates. Prince Doran received the letter with the slowness of a man who had learned that speed is a thing best used on level ground. He read it. He folded it. He sent for his brother. When Oberyn Martell came, he came as if every step were a laugh he meant to have later. He read the letter, and then set it down, and set the pad of his forefinger on the seal, as if he could learn from its shape whether the man who had pressed it had been standing up straight. "The king wishes to hear a Dornishman speak in his hall," Doran said. "Then a Dornishman will teach his hall how to listen," Oberyn answered. "He may be sincere," Doran said. "He may be alive," Oberyn replied. "Send me." "You will make an enemy of Tywin Lannister," Doran warned. Oberyn's smile showed all the wolf teeth he did not possess. "I have made that enemy already, brother. I wish now to keep his company where he must sit to hear me." Ravens flew back toward the capital, black parenthesis to black parenthesis, and in their wings was the promise of a conversation that would teach the court whether it had learned to be the place it pretended to be. Word from the north thickened into story. The first landed raiding party found a pebbled strand north of Sea Dragon Point, where the tide wrecked men's ears, and the gulls shrieked as if telling secrets. They built nothing, burned nothing, vanished like a flat stone thrown at just the right angle. The second was bolder. 3 longships slid up the rills under a cloudy moon and cut the throat of a shepherd who had never seen an Iron Man and had therefore believed all men would behave as he would. They took 5 sheep and an old woman's clean copper kettle and were gone before the neighbors gathered. The third was the kind the North calls a test. A ship tried White Harbor like a thief trying a door to see if the latch gives. It did not. Wyman Manderley's men were not quick, but they were broad, and they had been paid on time, and they had been taught that a slow man who does not sleep at his post can mock a fast man who does. Eddard Stark wrote again. He wrote that the marshes east of Moat Cailin were full of men in leather who knew how to make a stranger walk a path that was only a path if you knew the story of it from your father's tongue. He wrote that the shore at the Stony Shore had seen fires, but the fires could have been driftwood and bragging. He wrote that he would hold the North as a man holds a rope around a skittish horse. "Don't pull, unless you mean to break its neck," and asked for galleys in the bite. Robert read, and in the margin of his quiet, he heard his own blood count out the old march beat that in other years had coincided too easily with the clatter of cups. He called for Stannis and for a map. Stannis came with the map already folded to the corner where the bite looked like a mouth in winter. "We can send 6 galleys north around Dragonstone now," Stannis said. "Redwyn's men can finish 2 more within the fortnight if we don't demand pretty work on the rails. The oarsmen will be green but less green than if we hired them out of brothels. Gulltown can send 2. The sistermen can scrape 1 out of fish and bad luck if you promise them coin that doesn't skip on the scale." "Promise it," Robert said, "and see that it does not skip. Manderley will feed the galleys. He always has more fish than men to sell it to. If the Ironborn learn to be shy, I want them shy of our shadows. If they learn to be bold, I want them bold in the teeth of a chain they can see. You will go to sea." "Menendisau." Stannis inclined his head in that bare, stiff way of his that made men who did not know him think he was being insolent to gravity. "I will need captains," he said. "Not courtiers with boats. Men who can keep a straight line between a headwind and a lie." "You have one," said a rough voice from the doorway, and Robert turned and felt a flare of pleasure that surprised him with its warmth. Sir Davos Seaworth stood with his hands at his sides, as if keeping them visible would save him from the accusation of theft. He had the look of a man who had slept on a deck and had not minded, and the eyes of a man who had taught himself to read the difference between a storm and a squall by the taste of the air. "Your Grace," Davos said, and swallowed, not from fear of men in silk, but from fear of speaking when silence might have done better. "Begging pardon. The men down by the docks. Some of them used to ship onions, and some used to ship lies. The ones who shipped onions still remember how to make a sail move when it wants to sulk." "Nendarinder." Stannis' mouth flattened into something like approval. "Davos has a list," he said, as if he had long ago decided that the safest thing to do with all truths was to hand them to the king in the order they were requested. "He has names you won't hear in a city salon. He'll sit a deck with men who want spit when he passes. Then he'll sit a captain's chair," Robert said. "If it saves me a line of shine on a railing, I'll accept the loss." Davos blinked like a man who has been given a roof, when he had only asked for the use of a wall in the rain. "Eh?" he said softly. "We'll keep our lines." He did not bow. He did not know how to, not the way courtiers do. He made that economical dip that men in danger of falling make. He held himself as if the floor were a deck and not above treachery. When Davos had gone, Stannis said, with a reluctance that was itself an honor, "He will tell you the truth if you ask him. He will also tell you the truth if you don't. He is not a pleasant man." "Now, I have enough pleasant men," Robert said. "I lack truth-tellers who don't collapse into their own pride when they stand up." Lyanna found Davos later near the foot of the Red Keep, where the river of men coming and going narrowed, and you had to look at a stranger for a moment, if you meant not to walk into him. If Davos found it strange that the Queen wore boots and spoke in a voice that did not ask for the pleasure of being heard, he hid it inside the same habit of silence that had kept him free enough to grow to old scars. "You carried onions through a blockade once," she said without ceremony. "You saved men who would have died without them." "I carried other things at other times," he said, "and did not save anyone but my own sons." His gaze slid away and back again with the quickness of a man who has long learned to read a face to find out whether his mouth was about to make him a fool. "Your Grace, you will carry iron and orders now," she said. "There is a debt in that, if you like to think of it that way, and a chance to pay a little of it. Or there is a job that needs doing, if you prefer not to think of debts, because they breed." "Nem? In? Debts breed," he said, worn humor touching his mouth. "That's well said. I'll do the job." "Good," she said. "And tell me if anyone tries to make it into a story that's prettier than the truth. I like pretty things. I do not like lies told about them to make them hold still." Then, "Because there are gifts only those who have had dirt under their nails know how to give," she said. "What are your sons' names?" He said them, and she repeated them, and he looked at her as men look at people who do not pretend not to hear. They rode again to Winterfell, and to White Harbor, and to the scattered castles of the Rills and the Hornwood. They wrote to the Umbers, who write back with words that eat the quill, and leave a man with ink on his fingers and laughter in his beard. They wrote to Bear Island, and Lyanna took that one and kept it for a night and sat with it on her knee, the way a woman sits with a whetstone and leaves it a little smoother for having borne the weight. She wrote to Mage Mormont, and she wrote to the daughters, and she wrote to the memory of the women who stand in halls with axes, when men are dead or absent, and call that being a lady, with no trace of falsehood. She told them what the king meant, and what she would hold him to. If the Mormonts smiled at that, they smiled the way their islands smiled. Crookedly, and with their teeth in their heads still. On a morning that smelled of hot iron by the harbor, and of dust in the lanes, Oberyn Martell entered King's Landing like a man who had been born to discover cities and make them confess their secrets. The Red Viper's smile lit rooms the way a sudden strike of sun off water does. Real, obvious, dangerous. The court held itself taut like a thread between fingers that do not wish to pluck a note they cannot manage. Oberyn bowed to the king as if the act itself were a sign he had invented for the occasion, and glanced only briefly at Tywin Lannister, whose face did not move at all. He bowed to Lyanna as if to a rival who would make an excellent companion in a knife fight, and he bowed to Jon Arryn as if he were a dish of wine that had been properly aged and was about to make discourse tolerable. "The king calls Dorne to speak," Oberyn said. "Dorne arrives with sand on its boots and words in its mouth." "Sit," Robert said, gesturing not to a chair piled with cushions, but to a bench that had been built for petitioners. "We are all speaking from the same height today." The hall of the Red Keep looked different when men sat on benches. The empty space between the throne and the first row of listeners felt shorter, and the words that were sent across it walked rather than flew. For some in silks, this felt too much like the rooms in which they were born. For others, it felt like a small relief they dared not show. Tywin Lannister did not sit. He stood with his hands on the head of his cane as if that were a witness he had called and was now prepared to examine. "Sir Gregor Clegane," Jon Arryn said, voice perfectly level, "has been summoned to answer for the murders of Elia of Dorne and her children in the city he swore to keep. He has not come. Sir Amory Lorch has been summoned to answer for the murder of the Princess Rhaenys. He has not come. Let the absence be entered upon the roll." A clerk, with a hand like a careful spider, made the marks without squeaking his quill. The room listened to the sound, which was small and proper and contained. That was its power. Oberyn's mouth softened. "The mountain is afraid to descend," he said. "Sir Amory has rightly feared that his life will be measured against the length of a little girl's hair, and found wanting." Tywin's eyes did not leave the hand. "You speak of judgment, Lord Hand," he said. "You speak of it as if the King's Hall were a place in which the past is made to serve the hunger of the present." "The past," Jon Arryn said, "is a rope that we use to measure our honor. It is long enough that you do not have to cut it to make it reach. You only have to hold it true." "Ben?" Robert sat forward. "There will be no orchestrated mercy, my lord," he said to Tywin, quietly enough that the words did not look up to see if they had grown too large. "There will be no vengeance that hides under the table and bites at ankles like a rat. If Sir Gregor and Sir Amory do not come, they will be proclaimed outlaw. If they are sheltered by men who think themselves beyond shame, those men will learn that a king is not only a cup into which a man pours his wine. I will protect the realm. That is what a king does. That includes its memory." "Ben?" Tywin's face did not change. Inside him, the calculus shifted. If he wished to keep Clegane, he would have to keep him outside the law. That would cost something later. If he wished to offer Clegane, he would be handing over a weapon in exchange for a version of the story in which he had not designed its sharpening. He looked at Lyanna then, because she was the unknown in his sums, and found what he expected to find: a woman who had done the arithmetic of blood and found the numbers larger than men like to say they were. Oberyn spoke then, not as a man who had come to be entertained by a spectacle, but as a man who had stored a voice for this year and this hour. He spoke of Aelia not as a saint, not as a justification, but as a woman who had been ill-used by men who had mistaken their own rightness for a sword. He spoke of Rhaenys without making her into an angel. She had shouted, he said, in her small fear, and her shouting had been the only honest thing in the room where she died. He spoke of Aegon, whose skull had been broken because it had not yet learned to grow a hard shell over a soft brain, and he did not weep. The court was not treated to weeping. It was treated to the inconvenient proportion of a crime to a punishment. Then he stood and was silent, and silence felt like a cloth laid over a table on which men meant to eat without spilling. Robert breathed once and then again, and when he spoke his words were simple. "Dorne has been wronged. I cannot return a life. I can say that in my city, under my roof, such work is not the work of soldiers, but of thieves and cowards. The crown will pay the widow's portion to the house of Martell for the years in which a husband was not held by his wife and a father not seen by his children. The crown will give Dorne leave to pursue the man called the Mountain with any force it can muster that does not become treason. If he takes shelter under a lord's colors, those colors will be considered to have been soiled, and the lord will be made to wash them publicly with apologies and coin. That is the law today. Let it be the law tomorrow." "Ben?" Tywin's jaw creaked in a way that traveled up and down the benches like a cold draft. He did not speak. Lyanna did. "Also," she said, "there will be no songs about how sweet vengeance tastes. Vengeance is salted meat. You can carry it a long way, but you will die of thirst eating it." "Ben?" Oberyn looked at her as men look at people who have made a thing that was in their heads and broken it into words useful enough to hold. "I will remember that," he said, which from him was a promise and a challenge and a memory catalogued for later use. He nodded to Robert. "And I will take what you offer. Dorne has its own ways of paying its debts." "The crown will also pay its debt to Dorne," Robert said. "There will be a road cut between the Prince's Pass and the King's Road that does not spend 3 weeks asking the hills whether they would like to be civilized. We will send engineers from the Stormlands to consult your masons. We will not pretend our gifts are only measured in coin." Doran Martell's reply, when it arrived some weeks later, was as slow as his gait and as carefully shaped as a man's breath when he is trying not to cough blood. He accepted the road. He accepted the law. He wrote Elias' name on paper in a way that looked like the way he had once said it in a room that had smelled of oranges and old stone. For a time, Dorne did not boil. For a time, Tywin Lannister had to drink a cup of disappointment and pretend it was merely cool water not to his taste. Robert decided then that he would go north. It was not a king's whim. It was a thing the crown was obliged to do if it meant to claim that the rope of the realm stretched all the way to the place where the land rose its back up to meet the cold. He would not go like a lordling to be clapped at. He would travel with Lyanna and a small train, and Jon Arryn, and 2 white cloaks and a chest of heavier coins that could be used to pay men for building a bridge before winter. Tywin did not attempt to prevent him. He had learned over the long years of being himself that there are some movements of the board that one can only answer later, in a different place, with a different piece. He sent a cart of wine that was neither too old nor too sweet, and its labels were neat enough to be taken as an insult and also as a peace offering. Robert had a cup poured and sipped, and made a face because it was very fine. They set out when the sun had begun to tilt toward the later heat of the year, when the grasses along the road were dusty at the edges and the wells in the villages tasted a little of stone. They went up the Roserad, which was being taught to keep itself in better order than it had, and across it to the Gold Road, where men in red cloaks watched them pass from a distance suitable to a distance. They crossed the Blackwater Rush on a bridge that had been repaved the winter before, while the river kept telling its gossip to whatever ears it found. They came to the fork where the kings of old had decided that the realm would tell 2 stories at once, and they took the King's Road north. Travel is a great teacher when a man has decided he wants to learn. Robert discovered that inns run by women who did not fear the inference of men were cleaner and quieter and more profitable than inns kept by men who wanted to be liked. He discovered that the price of barley fluctuated within a day's ride of the same mill, according to whether the miller owed his mother-in-law coin. He discovered that children everywhere are brave until they are tired and vain until they are fed, and that the best way to quiet a child who called him king, as if it were a story, was to ask the child's name and tell him his own mouth was a better storyteller than the king's would ever be. At night, by candle and fire, Lyanna read to him from the day's notes. She had begun to keep them, not out of desire to prove herself to anyone at court, but because the act of writing the world down taught her how to make the world a place she could stand. She read of a bridge whose 3rd arch sagged, and of a woman who kept a little school in a village where boys could read the names of saints, but not of kings. She read of a tanner who had stopped fouling a stream, and of a boy who had been apprenticed to a smith, because the king had given him back his stolen coin, and because the smith had more sense than pride. She read of a lord steward who had believed he was the road, and not merely a man who walked it. At Harrenhal, they stood in the hall where stone had been melted by dragonfire, and had tried to hold air again. The ruin had a way of entering a man's bones and making them thoughtful. Robert laid his palm on a wall that had been as soft as bread when it was destroyed, and was now as hard as a lie, and he felt in it a rhythm that might have been his own blood, or might have been the memory of destruction made into architecture. Lyanna stood barefoot on a step that had once been a stair, and listened to wind move through holes too large for comfort. They did not speak of Rhaegar. They did not need to. The air had more of him in it than any name could hold. At River Run, Lord Hoster received them with the generosity of a man who has discovered that his debts to the future can be paid in dinners and well-spoken compliments. Lady Catelyn sat with Lyanna and spoke quietly of children and of duties that are the size of a cradle, and then the size of a small boy, and then the size of a sword. Catelyn had not wanted to love the North when she was first told to be its lady. Now she loved it the way women love a man they did not choose, because they have built a life with it and discover that it shares their bed without stealing their blanket. Eddard had gone north ahead of them. He would meet them at Winterfell. Lysa was not present. She had become the kind of absence that makes a house colder. They crossed the Trident at a ford that had decided it was tired of being a ford and would prefer to be a reckoning. The river was full of its own sound, and from the bank you could not hear a man who stood beside you, which is a kind of mercy. They slept that night in a longhouse where the host held a threadbare banner that had once been bright. and in the morning 3 girls helped Lyanna braid her hair as if they were plaiting summer into autumn, and hoped to keep more than they knew they could. As they went north, the world lifted its face like a wolf listening for snow. The air grew cleaner by degrees, not because it was morally superior, but because it had fewer people to tempt it into sins of smell. The King's Road narrowed through bands of tall trees that took it as a polite guest, not a conqueror. The first storm crow called out ahead of rain you could not yet feel. They came at last to a hill from which the land fell away toward Winterfell, and there, across the dusky evening, the castle lay spread like an old hand. Row fingers of wall, the palm of the god's wood, the veins of smoke that came straight up, because the air did not yet think to pull them away. Robert's throat closed and opened. He had had many homes. Storm's End, and Summerhall, and the world in between. But there was something about this place that made even a southerner feel that a man could be honest here, without having to translate himself first. Lyanna's breath changed in her chest. She put her hand on his arm as if steadying him, and perhaps herself. Eddard came down from the gatehouse, as if he had been standing there since the moment they had crossed the Trident, which he might have been, in his fashion. He did not stride. He walked with that contained energy of his which puts men in mind of a dog at heel that will run for miles when told to. His face had weathered. It wore the strange mathematics of the North in which lines mean endurance rather than decay. Beside him walked a boy with hair brown as wheat and a jaw already learning to be stubborn, and a red-headed girl who looked at the world as if it had made promises she meant to see kept, and another girl with eyes bright as flint, and 2 younger boys, and then a baby in Catelyn's arms who blinked at the world as if it had been invented for his benefit. Robert dismounted and then forgot to be king, which is as fine a way to greet family as any. He held Eddard with both arms and spoke inferences and curses and blessings into the man's shoulder. Lyanna bent to the children with a grace that made them immediately quarrel over who would please her more, and Catelyn, standing a little apart because she was careful with her own heart, smiled in a way that felt like the sound of rain on a roof. They ate in the great hall with its banners that have seen more winter than many men. The meal was honest. Stew heavy with venison and root, brown bread seasoned with its own heat, butter that had never read a court poem. The talk came slow and fit. Robert told Eddard of the chain, and of the judges in the market squares, and of Tywin's patience. Eddard told Robert of the men near the rills, and of the stubborn quiet of White Harbor, and of how much a sheep can teach a man about thieves if he watches it long enough. They spoke of the wall as men speak of a mountain that has always been in the distance, and has started to look a little closer because the air is clearer. In the Godswood, under the faces of leaves and the slow blind listening of the weirwood, Lyanna stood alone for a time. The Godswood at Winterfell had a smell that was unlike any other she knew, a clean rot, sweet and iron salt, like a promise being kept over centuries by something that did not understand failure. When Eddard came, he came without making the leaves flinch. They stood side by side and watched the slow drip of a leaf's point into a pool that had decided to pretend to be a mirror. "You've taught a southern hall to be quieter," Eddard said without looking at her. "I've taught myself," she said. "The hall is an accident." He smiled. "You never were," he said. "An accident." He waited. "Do you speak his name?" "Hiss." She asked, and then let herself be marked by honesty. "Sometimes. In the way you speak of a storm after it's passed. You check the roof, and you don't pretend you weren't afraid of hearing it lift." Eddard nodded. "I was a fool once about storms," he said. "I stood outside to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. The next day, I was ill. I learned to close the door and sit with the fear. Then I married a storm," she said, and laughed softly. "He learned to close the door." "You married a man who learned to love the sound of the door being closed," Eddard answered. "That's rare." They were quiet then, because they were stark, and because the Godswood values silence the way other rooms value wit. When they spoke again, it was of smaller things. A name day, a broken cart, a hound that had learned to sleep in odd places. The gods listened, not because they thought these things holy, but because they do not understand the difference men make between the holy and the ordinary. News comes to Winterfell like birds do, timid, sudden, precise. 2 riders arrived within 3 days of each other. The first had white fur clinging to his cloak, though his horse had been groomed. He brought word from the rills that a longship had grounded on a sandbar, and had been captured by men with nets who were not fishing. The second was a Gulltown crow, with a neat leg and a preference for fingers that did not shake. He brought word that the sisterman had chased a raider into water treacherous as old promises, and had watched it strike a rock with a noise like astonishment. Neither message asked the king to be a hero. Both asked him to be a king. Stannis will have sight of them from the galleys within a week, Eddard said over the table strewn with a map that had been drawn by a man who had never gone north of the Neck, and yet had understood how blue must curl where it meets green. Manderley has men eager to impress their own bellies at the sight of ironmen in chains. He'll keep his harbor like a man keeps a wife in a tempest. Then Stannis will be where he says he will, Robert agreed. Davos will teach the men to sing the strokes. If the Ironborn thought to come while the realm was sleeping, they have mistaken the hour. He looked at the map. Still, I would see the coast with my own eyes. You will have to pass the Neck, Lyanna said, and ask the Crannogmen to let you through their land without making you prove you deserve the path you put your feet on. They remember Stark, Eddard said. They will tolerate a Baratheon who comes dressed in good sense. Robert laughed. I can manage that for a week. He reached for the cup, and then did not drink, and Lyanna saw it, and her mouth made no comment, and that was better than any praise he had known. They went to the Neck with a smaller train yet, leaving Jon Arryn to nurse the city, and Tywin to nurse his pride, leaving Renly to arrange dinners that would be useful, leaving Varys to watch the mice and cats with equal curiosity. The land flattened and became a lesson in patience. The air changed its voice. Birds learned to say different things. The ground under the horses' hooves made a noise like a wet whisper. Men appeared and disappeared, as if the marsh had decided to wear faces now and again. Howland Reed did not present himself, but his people did, and they knew Eddard's boots and the way he turned his head for a bird he had not seen yet. They guided the king as if he were a boat with a shallow draught and a good heart. They gave him fish stew sour with green and a drink that tasted like the memory of winter. They told him stories that did not have kings in them, and he listened as if they did. On a rise that might have been more land than luck, they met a wind from the sea that had not been inland since last season. You could taste iron on it and the old bitterness of kelp. From there, the coast lay out in a long, undecided line, and the sky learned to rise a little higher. They saw White Harbor's smoke as a pale suggestion, and beyond, the gray wash of the Bight, and out upon it, like a scrap of a dark thought, a shape that could have been a ship. Eddard stood with his hands behind his back like a man in a hall waiting for judgment that he does not fear because he does not fear himself. Robert felt his body settle once again into the old readiness he had once mistaken for virtue. That eagerness, the coil and spring, did not move his hand to a cup now, and he felt that peculiar glow of pride that a man learns to have for himself only after he has thought little of himself for too long. There, he said quietly. There, Eddard agreed. If the gods are listening, they will let it be seen by men less important than we are. The gods, Lyanna said, prefer men who don't call themselves important. She shaded her eyes. Stannis will have them if they are fool enough to think a wind is all they need. On the second day, the wind changed, and with it came men. The first sighting was from a ridge east of White Harbor, where the grass grows stiff with salt and the ground makes a sound underfoot like a husk being folded. A column of smoke rose from the stony shore, and then flattened as if pressed by a hand. Manderley's galleys tilted out across the water like fat knives. To the north, gulls shouted and dived, and told more truth than any court gossip. Robert did not run toward it, because kings who run make men stupid. He watched. He sent a rider. He sent a second rider for the sake of redundancy. He had men stand to, and he told others to sit, and he made the kind of choices it takes a man a lifetime to be able to make in a minute, because he has made all the small choices every day. Lyanna walked the line and looked in faces. Some of those faces had looked at her as if she were a story. Some of them now learned she had teeth and a voice used to saying, "Do that thing now." Word came back from the coast that the raiders had tested a hamlet and found it bristling with men who were not soldiers, but had been taught that a line is a line even if it is held by farmers. A woman with gray in her hair and a scar on her chin had put an arrow in the hand of a man who tried to pull a brand out of a hearth. The Ironborn left 3 dead, because they did not like to leave work half-finished, even of that kind. Then they ran to their ship and pushed off like cowards who had remembered they loved their lives. Manderley's nearest galley gave chase, oars biting, men shouting the new count they had learned from Davos. Out in the deeper water, farther than any man could swim, a shape like a trimmed claw slid between longship and harbor cutter. The royal galley Stannis had named Stone's Will for his childhood at Storm's End, and his habit of never accepting sand where a rock would do. Davos stood at the tiller because he had little patience for men who thought a tiller ornamental. The sea was in one of her practical moods. He spoke to his oarsmen as if they were horses pulling a cart full of something that would spoil if it were late. When the longship tried to slip the wind between 2 low spits, Davos took the Stone's Will into water shallow enough to make a lord hold his purse. The harbor cutter took the other side. The longship's captain chose a rock poorly. Later, in a hall that had been pressed into the role of a court for this one day, a man with hair salted white before his time, and a beard that tried to make him look older failed at the attempt to be proud. He was brought before the king and the Lord of the North, and the Warden of the Narrow Sea. The room smelled of wet wool and pitch and onions and iron, and the kind of sweat that men are not ashamed of. There were women there with their sleeves rolled up, who would have gone home by then if someone had not told them that they had a right to watch the law proceed. "What were you sent to find?" Eddard asked the Iron Man. He spoke not as one who expects to be lied to, but as one who will stand still and listen while a liar discovers that words do not bend as easily in certain rooms. "Wood," the man said. "The Driftwood King pays for wood brought from north of White Harbor because the islands have none to spare." "Stolen sheep," said one of the men from the hamlet, without shouting. "You took Yorick's black ewe. I saw it with my eyes." "Men," the Iron Man added, and shrugged, trying to make men into a kind of driftwood. "If Pete died all. If not, then not. Nay, for thralls," Lyanna said, and did not make the word pretty. The man blinked and did not pretend to misunderstand. "Women," he said then, because the thing had been put on the table and would not be put back under it by lies. "If fit, never the old. The old we leave to tell the others to be wise." Robert's jaw worked. He had known depravity dressed in better clothes than this. He had seen murder wearing silk. Somehow, the blunt language of the Ironborn, the way the man tried to take pride in making a theft into a trade, offended him with a white-hot purity that silk never managed. "The price," Robert said, "for raiding along the stony shore at a time when the crown has not declared war, is the loss of your ship and your liberty." He looked at the Iron Man, at the woman with the gray hairs, at the men with the tanned faces and the marks of salt. "You will not be hanged," he said at last, and heard the hall breathe. "You will work. Winter is coming. There are roads that need mending, and there are ditches that need digging, and there are walls that need being taught how to stand. When the snow is deep enough that the old women approve of it, you will be given your choice. Swear and go home, and tell your people that the North and the Crown are one rope, or go to the wall, where your pride will be of use to no one including yourself. If you misbehave in the meantime, you will be hanged for the lesson of it. That is the law today." "Thou." Stannis looked as if he had bitten into something that had turned out to be precisely what the seller had said it was, and thus was more satisfying than any trick. Eddard's mouth made a shape that, in him, counted for a nod. The Ironman tested the law with his eyes, and found that it held as one tests a plank with a heel, and finds it doesn't give. He lowered his chin. The women in the hall did not cheer. They did not need to. The work itself would be satisfaction enough. In White Harbor, Wyman Manderley received them with the bruised grandeur that always seems to sit easily on a man who knows exactly how much bacon he owns. He did not bend. He bowed and in doing so, made a bow look like a kind of lordly laziness. He praised the judges. He praised the chain. He praised the way coin had begun to clink the same way in the south and the north. Then he brought out a dish of little fried fishes that tasted like the sea caught at the moment between cruelty and blessing, and fed them to the king with his own fingers. And if there was insult in that, there was also affection. Davos, summoned to speak, stood under the harbor chain, only a link here for demonstration, and looked at it like a man who had once been caught under a net and had survived, and had learned to respect it more for that. "Stones don't lie," he said. "Wood lies when it's wet and a man wants to get home. Iron lies when a man wants to go faster than the sea lets him. This chain, if you pull it wrong, it breaks. If you grease it cheap, it shrieks the truth. But if you set men to it who know their work, and you keep hands that can count and eyes that won't sell themselves for a hot-baked eel pie, it'll go up and down long enough to be old and cranky before it's old and weak." End. Robert wanted to clap him on the shoulder and tell him he spoke better than any lord he had heard in a year. He did not, because Davos would not thank him for being turned into a story. He nodded to Stannis, and Stannis, without being told, spoke in numbers, and Manderly, without being urged, answered in promises that sounded like debts he was cheerful about being made to pay. They had word of 2 more longships taken with no glory, which is the way the North likes to write stories about its enemies. One ran aground trying to flirt with a sandbar. The other thought to play with a current it had not properly met, and learned that men in small boats who know how to work a tide are more dangerous than a lord in a flagship. After that, for a while, the wind came out of the east, and the Ironborn went to count their ribs and their pride in their halls of black stone and dried fish, and pretend they had not been chased like boys from an orchard. Robert would have liked to stay. He wanted to sit in Winterfell and learn whether a hall that did not lie could teach him to require that honesty of his own. He wanted to ride in the Wolfswood with Eddard and say things that only trees hear. He wanted to watch Lyanna in the unstupid happiness she wore when she could laugh without thinking of who might put it into a song. He wanted to stand in the Godswood and forget he was a king long enough to remember how to have been a boy. He did a part of all that, in the small spaces a king finds in his day, if he wakes early and goes to bed without drinking. But he did not do as much as his appetite demanded. A king's appetite for the ordinary is always larger than the world will let it be. They turned south at last under clouds that had been told the story of snow too many times not to be tempted to try it early. The road felt easier going down. They stopped at Moat Cailin, which holds the world by the throat and does not boast about it. The Crannogman gave them a farewell that did not make a show of being a farewell. It was more of a polite disappearance. In the Riverlands, the fields were already gray at their margins, and in one village where the trees had been felled unwisely, men spoke of a winter they would not be able to lie to and asked for stone to build a wall high enough that their shame would not be seen. Robert promised stone. He was not generous. He was exact. Messages intercepted their journey like birds changing branches. In King's Landing, Sir Beric had departed west with his 50, light and bright. Tywin had said nothing about it. The judges in the markets had begun to carry walking sticks with iron caps, not because they wished to use them, but because they found that men wished less to be fools when a stick was visible. The chain had lifted and lowered twice a day in practice, and once in anger when a wine captain, with too much pride, tried to slip out upon a tide that had not been invited to be his. Stannis had fined him and made him sit on the quay and listen to how the chain worked until his ears forgiven him. There was also a missive in a fine, meticulous hand from Old Town. Archmaester Valen, who counted money with a fastidiousness that would have been irritating had it not been so useful, wrote to say that the new measures had been weighed and stamped, and that the bell metal sounded the same in the Citadel as it did in the King's Tower. He added dryly that when measures are honest, men who depend on lies become better poets. Jon Arryn would enjoy that. Robert suspected that Lyanna might enjoy it more. There was, too, a rumor wrapped inside a letter from Braavos. It was written by a man whose trade was to know who liked whose dinners. It said that a silver-haired boy had been invited to eat sweetmeats by a man with rings on every finger and grease in his heart. It said that the girl in the thin house had been given a doll with hair like her own, and the doll's head came off easily, and was put back on with a slot and tab like a game. Robert read it with the attention a man gives to the first itch of an illness, and then folded it and put it away. Mercy not as accident, John had said. Watchfulness not as paranoia. When they came again within sight of the city, the chain lay slack across the water, and men moved over it with hammers and cups for oil. The city's breath smelled of tar and bread. The bells were not ringing because no one had told them to. That, too, was a kind of grace. In the throne room, the benches still stood. Men used them now without comment. Tywin Lannister had gone home, and the room had grown larger for it. On the dais, Jon Arryn laid before Robert a summary of the month, as if it were a field at harvest. What had come in? What had been left in the weather? What had been stored in a place where mice could not be relied upon? Renly had acquired around him a constellation of young men who had discovered that charm could be a trade, if applied to the right stone. He put them to work on the boring tasks that ruin boys and use men. Stannis returned with Davos and a roll of names of men who had done work and had not been paid by their old masters, and asked that they be paid now for their new honesty. Varys told him of Viserys' latest tantrum in the house of the fattest man in Pentos, and of how the girl had learned to sing to herself to sleep with a northern lullaby she could not know the words to because no one around her knew them either. Then someone remembers something, Lyanna said. And the room flexed that little way it does when a sentence lands inside it like a thought. Robert looked at his hands and at the realm that had begun to depend on them. He had thought once that the work of kingship would be a kind of constant battle. Noise and blood and the pleasure of a clean strike. It was, and it wasn't. There was battle in it, but more often there was the patient denial of tyrannies so small they liked to be mistaken for habits. There were girls in markets and boys on roads. There were numbers that behaved if watched by the right eyes. There were men like Tywin who thought they could make the truth stand still. There were men like Stannis who taught it to march. The trial by absence of the men of the West proceeded. Proclamations were read in squares. A scribe whose hand had once slanted when he was nervous now wrote straight. Ser Beric came back with his 50, having learned that tracks can disappear when gold is spread carelessly on a floor, and that oaths become rope when they are being held by the right hands. Men whispered that the mountain had gone north to where justice walks more slowly. Oberyn said in a salon where men had been pretending to be bored for 3 hours, that the mountain had gone south into a legend he would not survive. No one laughed. Some men changed the subject with the haste of cowards. Some did not. Snow fell in the passes between the Red Mountains and did not last. Rain fell on the Roserwad and washed out a culvert that had not been built to its proper depth. The foreman responsible wrote a letter to Jon Arryn describing his error in a hand unashamed and requested timber to do it again. Jon sent the timber and a note saying, "You have made me proud. Do it again." Winter would come later. There would be wolves and men more dangerous than wolves. There would be other letters from the east and other ships from the west. There would be nights when Robert would stand at the window, and the city would appear to him like a patient whose fever had broken and might come back. There would be mornings when the yard's mud would taste like victory and like old work. There would be arguments with Lyanna, sharp and quick like flint under steel, and afterward the small serious laughter of two people who knew they were not each other's enemies and would not be. For the present, there was a day. It was the sort of day that nations are actually built out of, a day with court at third bell, and a petition from a woman whose brother had been tricked out of his share of a fishing boat, and a boy whose pigeon loft had been burned by his cousin, because the cousin had wanted to teach the world how to hate him and had succeeded, and a letter from Old Town asking for an opinion on a new calendar that would have made harvest come on more convenient of barley spoiled in the hold of a ship that had been caulked hastily to make it ready to sail for a noble's name day, and a mercer insisting that green should be taxed differently because it had always been taxed differently, and a blind singer at the gate who had to be told that while he had the right to sing there, he did not have the right to tell lies about the king's wife, and a girl carrying a chicken in both arms, Ace the bird held the key betterly. Robert heard them all. He spoke when it was his place to speak, and when it was Joan's, he did not. He reached for the cup and found, when he lifted it, water. He drank, and it was good. When he set the cup down, the sound it made on the wood was an honest sound. The small sounds of the realm continued. Of ink, of feet, of oars dipping, of chain links being tested, of ravens' wings, of men learning new habits and keeping their old decencies, of houses being patched before storms, of laughter that has done the math on grief and decided to survive. In the evening, Lyanna came in from the godswood and shook rain from her hair onto the hearthstone and did not apologize. She sat and put her bare feet on the fender as if she were a girl again, and as if the world had been made to permit this exact thing for this exact time. The bay smelled of clean iron today, she said, as if the chain had decided to be a river for a moment, and the sea had agreed. Robert leaned his weight back in the chair that had learned to bear him without creaking. I am told, he said, that iron lies when men do, but sometimes it tells the truth when men cannot agree upon it. Now, she looked at him, and the look said, you have listened. He did not count that as praise. He counted it as a record of work done. A fresh letter came from White Harbor that night, and Robert opened it with the small eagerness of a man who has learned that good news can be quiet. Wyman Manderley reported that a ship of the Ironborn had beached at the far end of a bay and had been found by women gathering seaweed who had told it to go away. The ship had gone away because the chain lies there now in their minds, Manderley wrote, in a hand surprisingly neat for such fat fingers, and because our duck pies taste better when not made of fear. Robert laughed then, softly, and thought not of war banners but of duck pies, and of chains lying in men's minds, and of the slow education of a realm. He slept, and his sleep was not a hero's but a man's. He woke early and stood again at the window and tasted the salt. He would go to the yard. He would sit the council. He would tell the truth to petitioners in the afternoon and not make them wait a week. He would listen to John. He would argue with Stannis. He would let Renly charm a mercer who needed to be charmed into doing what the law would have forced him to do less willingly. He would accept Varys' whisper about a boy across the sea and keep his hands clean of blood he did not need to have there. He would love his wife, who would make him bear out his own best thoughts and not let him be satisfied with his best day as if it were an excuse to have two worse. Beyond the walls, the bay waited like a beast trained to pull without biting. The chain looked black and honest against the water. In the west, a large man sat in a hall that made other men feel small and told himself a story in which he had not been outmaneuvered. In the south, a prince turned his chair carefully to avoid pain and wrote the names of his dead once more as if writing them might change the world's arithmetic. In the north, a man stood in a godswood and watched his breath and the breath of a red tree and thought about on winter eve when thought his brothels. Across the narrow sea, a boy with pale hair sharpened his sullen pride on the stories of men who were gone. A girl sang to herself under a window and wondered if the song would carry far enough to reach a hill with snow on it. The realm held them all in its patient, stubborn geography. It also held the day. And the day, in the Red Keep, began again the way the good days now did. Quietly, with work. The bells, roused, found their voices without frenzy. The king dressed himself and went out to meet the morning with a body that did not lie to him. The master-at-arms brought the maces. The blows found their marks, and the men who watched saw more than show. When the hour was done, Robert washed his face at the pump with water so cold that he laughed. A short bark that had nothing to do with scorn and everything to do with being alive. Sir Barristan came with a measure of urgency that never oversold itself. Your Grace, he said, there is a delegation waiting from the cobblers and a note from Old Town concerning the standard for nails. Nails, Robert said and grinned, without which the world comes apart. He clapped the old knight on the shoulder. Let us hold it together then. They did. Or rather, they went about the work of doing so, which is a better truth and a better story, and one the realm had begun to learn to tell about itself without embarrassment.